I'm very happy to inaugurate the second Edmund Gordon lecture. We began last year in this lecture sponsored by the Institute for Urban and Minority Affairs, which Ed Gordon led for many, many years. He, of course, was one of our great scholars at Teachers College and one of the great leaders in American education and American educational research. So we do this in his honor. And we're very proud to have our guest and our speaker tonight, Vanessa Siddle Walker. And Amy Stewart Wells is going to be introducing her and saying a word about her and about the topic. And this is also the culmination of a day-long conference on educating Harlem. So we have a very, very nice confluence here tonight. I just want to make one personal comment about Vanessa Siddle Walker. And this is only because I served as dean at the School of Education at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I have to tell you, in Chapel Hill, Vanessa Siddle Walker is a big name. I mean, she's a big name generally, but especially there. She went there as an undergraduate. She's from Caswell County. I know that because I was there and knew alumni and things like that. And she had her first teaching job in Chapel Hill High School. And so this was Chapel Hill High School desegregated because it was, there's this whole history there that, flowing over those years. So that's just kind of in a sense, a personal connection where she's a legend. She's also a legend in educational research for good reason, as you will see from what she's going to say. And I'm going to leave it to Amy Stewart Wells to do the rest of the introduction. Thank you for being here.
I know it's somewhat cliche when you're asked to do an introduction of an eminent scholar to say that you're honored and privileged, but there's nothing cliche about my saying that I'm deeply, deeply honored and privileged to be doing the introduction tonight of Vanessa Siddle Walker and giving the distinguished Edmund Gordon lecture. And I'm doubly honored because of the connection between Dr. Gordon's work and Dr. Walker's work. So Dr. Edmund Gordon, as we know, is not only a preeminent scholar, a caring colleague, mentor, and role model, and one of the most morally just and courageous people I know. He's widely known for his research on diverse human characteristics in pedagogy and the education of low status and marginalized populations, including his groundbreaking work on career development of Black males who've overcome enormous odds to become high achievers, his concept of affirmative development of academic ability and supplementary education, both which focus on improving the quality of academic achievement in diverse learners. Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker's paradigm-changing historical scholarship helps us to more fully understand and appreciate Dr. Gordon's intellectual contribution to the field of education and to the mission of social justice. Vanessa Siddle Walker is the Samuel Candor Dobbs Professor of African American Education and Educational Studies at Emory University. For 25 years, she's explored the segregated schooling of African American children, considering sequentially the climate that permeated the schools, the network of professional collaborations that explains their similarity, and the hidden systems of advocacy that sought equality and justice. Her first single-authored book, Their Highest Potential, an African-American School Community in the Segregated South, received the prestigious Grawemeyer Award for Education and the Best New Book Award for the History Division of the American Educational Research Association. She is co-author of Facing Racism in Education, Racing Moral Formation, and author of Hello, Professor, a Black Principal and Professional Leadership in the Segregated South. Her current project, which she will be discussing tonight, is Hidden Provocateurs, H.E. Tate and Black Educators' Secret Struggle for Justice. It's in contract with the New Press. In addition to book manuscripts, her work has appeared in journals such as the Harvard Educational Review, Review of Educational Research, American Educational Research Journal, and our own Teachers College Record. Dr. Walker has received numerous awards, including the AERA Early Career Award, the Best New Female Scholar Award from the Research Focus on Black Education. Oops, there's so many, I need many pages. the Outstanding Book Award from the Moral Development Special Interest Group. In 2009, she was named a Fellow of the American Educational Research Association. Dr. Walker has lectured widely nationally and internationally, including delivering the 2012 annual AERA Brown versus Board of Education lecture in DC. Dr. Walker taught for 4 years in the desegregated Cummings High School in Burlington, North Carolina, and completed her master's and doctorate at Harvard Graduate School of Education. But I know Dr. Walker to be far more than the sum of these parts. I know her to be a good friend and a colleague, a phenomenal mother and advisor to the next generation, and a focused and committed scholar who never wavers from her mission to tell us the untold stories, to speak for the silenced voices of Black educators of a prior era. She is here with us at Teachers College to tell us of their story. And because she is a historian who is fully aware of what those lost lessons could have contributed to the happiness and success of millions of children moving forward into an era of school desegregation in the late 1960s and now on into an era of accountability in which the work of Dr. Gordon is so greatly needed. Because these voices were not heard the first time, I suggest we listen very carefully tonight. So it is my honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker.
I'm not exactly sure how one blends a very personal story from Chapel Hill, which is a little scary because I can't figure out who you knew in Chapel Hill that knew I started out at Chapel Hill High School because I didn't like those people. And so that feels a little weird. And then, of course, Amy pretty much has told me what to do for the last 15 years. She says, oh, Vanessa, meet me at this restaurant. And I show up. Oh, Vanessa, I need you to come to TC to do X. And I show up. Last night, when I should have been sleeping for this lecture, she said, oh, no, we have to have Ethiopian food at my house. So if I go to sleep halfway through, that'd be Amy's fault. In all seriousness, I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I won't use the terms honored and privileged either, but I can't think of any others that would be more appropriate. The educators that I have spent so many years now writing about were educated at Teachers College, many of them, and particularly my own informants. And so when I walk along the halls, I see people that I know, that I've written about, even though they're not in the halls today. The difficulty is that while Teachers College invited these educators into a wonderful space and taught them a lot, Teachers College doesn't know a whole lot about what happened to them when you sent them home. And so what I want to be able to do, what I want to do tonight is to talk about what happened to those educators when they went home. And Amy, when you use the language to represent the voices, that speaks exactly to what I'm thinking about this evening, because it is my honor not just to be at Teachers College, but to be able to represent for them back to you the people that you sent out. So let's start. One of the things that we want to, the Black educators said you always go from the known to the unknown. That's Dewey. That's their version of Dewey. So one of the things I want to talk about is what's our common ground before we think about these educators. What is it that unites us here tonight? And I think if I were to think about going from the known to the unknown in our conversation and thinking about what unites us, I would say that we are probably all united, most of us, in our concern about the current climate of education. I think we all care a lot about that. I think by anybody's standards, we're in a mess. And I could go through the details, except my guess is you know all the details. They're happening in New York, just like they're happening in Georgia and states throughout our country. Our children seem to be the least of what we're concerned about, at least when it comes to politicians and figuring out real ways to educate those children. And so it seems to me that that's what binds us here tonight. So the question then is, if we're interested in these kind of oppressive circumstances, this context in which we live, then What is it that we want to do with Black educators? Well, I would argue that Black educators lived in a system very similar to our own, and one could argue even more oppressive. That these educators also had a climate where federal money went to states, and then states used it however they wanted to, and usually not for Black schools. I would argue that they had challenges with regard to parents being able to advocate, because they had many parents that were illiterate. I would argue that they were repressed by states. They didn't have facilities, they didn't have resources, they didn't have transportation, they couldn't even vote. So their situation is also an oppressive kind of world. What I want to consider then is, how did these people respond in this oppressive climate? Because it seems to me, if we can think about, well, we're oppressed, and there are these other people who are oppressed, so how do we make sense of their oppression, and then can we loop it back and see whether or not there's anything about their story that would allow us to ask new questions in our own context? It's history, it won't map it, but maybe it can help us ask some new questions. So what I want to do tonight is talk about, Amy, I'm actually not talking about Hidden Provocateurs, the book on which I'm currently working. What I want to do tonight is actually think about 3 school-level strategies that these educators implemented in oppressive circumstances. So within oppression, there is a resilience. It's Bullock's notion of the unintended consequences. We didn't necessarily plan for you to be educated, but people say, but we are going to figure out how to be educated. It seemed to me, and Professor Morrell, forgive me for not thanking you earlier. Thank you for the lovely opportunity to be here. And our conversations before coming, and he talked with me about the audience, and I said, you know, it seems that we should think about what can we do within schools. I mean, there's a lot that we can talk about outside of schools, but let's think about what can we do within schools. So what I've done is narrow this talk to what are 3 examples of something that happened within schools that allowed people to resist oppressive circumstances. Now, did they do more than this? Absolutely. They also had a hidden system of advocacy and networking. That's the subject of the current book that I'm writing. And that's a very important system, because it is in that space that they speak back to the oppression. That's very important. But tonight, it seems more important to think about what happens within schools and how people respond to oppressive climates. So let's look at that. Before I talk about the 3 areas, I need to contextualize it and give you a sense of how individual schools lived in a broader educational network. When I first wrote Their Highest Potential, I'd go to places and lecture, and almost every place I went, people would say, I went to a school just like that. You know, if it was an older person, they'd say, I went to a school just like that. And I would think, that's odd. I thought Mr. Dillard, was special. You mean everybody wanted their children to reach their highest potential? In Texas? They wanted that in Virginia too? Florida? How in the world did they create schools that were so similar that they actually even used the same language to explain what they're trying to accomplish? How did they do that? So I want to take just a quick moment and give you the answer, if you will, to that question. Much of this is described in Hello, Professor. But I want to go over this because what we see in schools is a product of this larger climate that helps people do it. So it would be unfair to suggest it rose directly from the school without some contextualization. So here we are. What I've represented here is a pedagogical network. The South, not the North. Although we see people from northern states present in this network, but when we see them in 1s and 2s, like 2 people from Illinois, right? Or 1 person comes from New York. By and large, it is a southern network. This network, we see the similarity in ideas across time and across geography. And I'd like to describe a little bit about how it works. At the top, I've tried to note this wider world of which they were a part of. This Teachers College will be part of this, institutions of higher ed in the North, the federal climate, HBCUs, others. The point is that they never worked in isolation. They were very familiar with what was happening pedagogically, what was happening in Washington, what was happening in the world. Very clear about the influences on what it is that they're trying to do. They create two different associations. Both of these associations are the result of exclusion. One of them is the association. For reasons I don't know, I wish I'd ask, that is actually how they pronounced it. They do not say the association, so I'm repeating how they said it. They say the association, and depending upon what day it was, they put a lot of emphasis on the association. I think there was a message there. One is the association, which is the counterpart to the Southern Association, the accredited body in the South. So they create their own because they're excluded from participation in the larger one. So they create theirs. As well, they create the American Teachers Association, which was formerly the Association of Teachers in Colored Schools. This is because they can't be participants in the NEA. These meetings happen once a year, nationally, sometimes in the same place and location as the white meetings that they can't go to, and people cross the meetings. So you'll see Allison Davis at an ATA meeting, but you'll also see him at an association meeting, right? So the ideas and the people are crossing back and forth. The structure looks a lot like the white teachers' associations, but they differ in their norms and accountability and their values. So you've got something that looks like what they are imitating, but actually works in a different kind of way. When they move from the national into the state, they have a whole series of meetings. I'm giving you what happens in Georgia. But from the data that we have available, it looks like the exact same thing happens throughout the South. In differing forms, but the basic structure is similar. So within the state, you'd have state meetings once a year, and they would intentionally take the topics from the national meetings and go into the state and discuss those particular topics. Then they'd break the state up into regions. So in Georgia, there were 11 regions, and you'd have 11 regional meetings. The regional meetings are scripted, so whatever we talk about at the national meeting, the state meeting, now we'll go into our region, and we'll talk about those meetings. In addition to, and I'm referring to the ones along the far left, your left. And in addition to the regional meetings, they also have local study groups. These aren't in an individual school. These would be several schools, say in a county, getting together and deciding to have study groups. And so you'll get examples of teachers who will meet on a Saturday morning. And the example I'm thinking about is from the 40s. They're meeting on a Saturday morning so they can discuss, what are you doing in your school? This is what I'm doing in my school. We need to try to figure out how to solve these problems, and so on and so forth. So there are these local study groups that they're having. So their issue was to figure out how to solve the problems for black children. Okay? This is along the left. But now suppose you were a leader. Then you'd look over to the right. If you were a leader, you had a series of leaders' meetings that you were supposed to go to. One of them would be the School Masters Club. So this would be the state version of the association. You with me? Okay. So if you had an accredited, as they did for Negro schools in that time, if you had a so-called accredited, approved school, you would be automatically a member of the School Masters Club. It was a big deal to be a member of the School Masters Club in Georgia, because these are those accredited schools. If you were a principal who aspired to have an accredited school, but you didn't have one yet, you would have just gone to the principals' conferences. Principals' conferences happen once a year. The School Masters Club meetings usually happen 3 or 4 times a year. If you missed everything, you could just read about it in the journal. Their journal was the Herald, and the earliest publications we have are the early 1930s, and they cover whatever it was we talked about before. So the result here, this in and of itself, I'm rushing through it, but it's the context that I think is important. what I want you to understand is that there's a very sophisticated mechanism to exchange ideas. This is why I could talk to a principal in Georgia and he'll say, I want my children to reach their highest potential. And that's what they'll say in Texas and so on and so forth. Now, you might say, well, that's a nice structure. I mean, you know, that's good. But the fact that they have the structure doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to disseminate the ideas through the structure, right? I mean, that's what I would say if I was sitting out there and I were talking to me. I would say, okay, that's nice. But that doesn't necessarily mean the ideas are that tightly connected. So let me just give you one example. I picked my personal favorite because I'm the one talking, and there are lots of examples that we can show how they filter through, but this is my personal favorite. And it is my personal favorite because we spend so much time talking about testing, and I just thought it'd be nice to see what Black educators were saying about it way back. So this comes from Black Educators Meeting, an association meeting, early December in 1957. They're in Richmond, Virginia. And first, we've got the expert talk. Okay, this is the kind of talk we would have, you know, at our little fancy meetings. So they've got somebody from ETS there, and he's presented, and I want to just give you an example of some of the questions that they're asking. Dr. Finley, will we get a more accurate picture of the intellectual powers of these children and a raw socioeconomic status by varying the instruments of testing? And Dr. Finley responds. And he says, Dr. Finley, I didn't make myself clear, I'm sure. I was not referring to achievement tests. I was referring to the test of the intellectual ability on which we base our diagnosis of children's readiness to learn. Would you comment on that? And he responds. And then somebody else says, well, how can you overcome the problem of bringing the low-performing group up to acceptable standards with the same number of teachers? Wouldn't one have to have more teachers working with these groups? Has a study been done on pupil-teacher ratio in this connection? And the list goes on and on. By the end of the meeting, I feel sorry for Dr. Finley. And I don't even know this man because he's just, I mean, you can see in the transcript that they have just beat him up almost with questions as they try to do it. So this is December where they're having this conversation. Let's go to Georgia, to the Herald. And when we are with the Herald, here we are in 1958, and here's one of the articles on intelligence testing. Let's go to the regional meetings. 11 regions involved, more than 8,000 teachers. And what are they talking about? It's the focus of their regional meetings, giving consideration to the testing program in Georgia. And let's go to a school. In this particular school, they decide that they are going to use the national merit, I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out my technology, that they're going to use the national merit exam, and they're just going to hand give it in their school and just kind of score it and see what's going on. Scores, of course, are low, right? But if you actually pay attention, we just made it look fancy. It's a handwritten chart. But if you look at it, you'll see over time in every area that the kids are actually improving, which I think is extraordinary context to the assumption that Black kids' test scores didn't start going up until desegregation. At any rate, and in the same school, they're talking about teacher-made tests and so on and so forth. The Black educators in Georgia do so much with testing over time that the white educators actually said, that is really interesting. Maybe we should do some tests for white kids. It's a whole flip on how we've thought about it. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that the in-school activities are contextualized by a network of support, and that the kinds of things that I am sharing here tonight happen, in some cases, in a maverick setting, but they happen throughout the South because the mechanism for information dissemination allows people who don't know each other to do similar things. So let's look at 3 areas. First, there are the general curricular concerns. Curriculum for African American educators is a form of resistance. They are attempting to build resilience in these children, and curriculum is a way to do it. They cannot let the superintendent come in and catch them saying, y'all need to start the revolution. Okay, because to use the Southern vernacular, because what they doing to y'all don't make no sense, and y'all need to go out there and do something. They can't do that. They would lose their jobs immediately. So what they do is craft a form of utilizing curriculum to get at their own ends. Now, this is very important because they incorporate the language of the wider society, but they appropriate its purposes. So citizenship education becomes a really great example, right? If you are American and you're white, you can grow up to be president. But if you are American and you're black and you're in the South, these teachers can't vote, as I said earlier. How do you get these children to move beyond the script the white South has for them? Because the script that they have been given by the white South is that you are supposed to be docile, you're supposed to find your place in the social order, and just in case you didn't know, your place is at the bottom. Those were the larger goals. So how can we work within curriculum to figure out how to get children to do something different? Lucy Laney, a black educator, principal of a private school in Georgia, this is 1919, and I'm so glad that she said this directly, because otherwise it would have been, you'd see the correlations, but you couldn't say for sure it was intentional. Lucy Laney says directly, this is what we're going to do. She says, in the South, we made up our minds, as we made them up a long time ago, and have been working along that line. She's referring to the work in Reconstruction, okay, that they'd started. She says, but not always effectively. So in other words, we started something during Reconstruction, but it's not fully working. So we're going to do something for ourselves, she says. We're going to start anew in a way we know is going to be effective. We're going to start at the bottom with the children. We'll teach them history, vote, government. Can I do this? Yes. Civics education is part of what I'm supposed to be teaching. So let's look at how black teachers do this. This is the Valina C. Jones School Republic. This is from the 1930s, and it is an elementary school. In this particular school, you will see that they've been organized to be a republic with each room a state, and officers within each state, including the governor, a lieutenant governor, a treasurer, a secretary of state, senators, judges, policemen, and so forth, in detail that's not there. This is a very elaborate curriculum. They talk about how the children have to develop parliamentary procedures, make rules, pass resolutions for the good of the republic, and send them to the Senate after being signed by the Secretary of the State. The teacher is the advisor of the state, and the principal is the advisor of the Senate. There are detailed descriptions for the election process for the Senate, including the primary and the final election, as well as detail on the duties of the Senate and their work. Their monthly meetings, they have to initiate legislation. They divide the school grounds for duty. They assign class projects. They have to work with the PTA to get material needs for the schools. This is children, elementary school children. They have to plan programs, and they have to plan and write a constitution. Now, grades 3 through 7 are the republic. The lesser grades, 1 and 2, are the territories, which I think is quite interesting. And they also have a creed that is a pledge to the republic. Now, this importation of democracy into the fabric of the school was not the intent of the southern states. But black educators, again, can defend it by saying, oh, you said we're supposed to teach civics. Let's go to the 1940s, and let's look at a high school as an example. This is Booker T. Washington High School. It's the first public high school in Atlanta. Coincidentally, Michelle Obama was there a week or two ago telling the black kids there they should stay in school. I wish somebody had asked me to come and tell her about the history of Booker T. Washington, but alas, I don't know Michelle Obama, and so she didn't even know where she was. But she was at Booker T. Washington High School. I mean, I love Michelle Obama. I'm not trying to, I just wish she knew more about it. So it's the first public high school in Atlanta. Now, like the Jones Republic, there's attention to citizenship in this particular school and its meaning. In 1924, when the school begins, there are courses on political awareness. Throughout its history, voting and mock elections, and we've even got pictures of some of that. One student heads the Independent Party, another heads the Progressive Party. They organize the whole school into this. They do educational tours to D.C. so they can help them see America and so on and so forth. But consider some of the world as it is evident on this particular slide. In 1938, the principal, Charles Harper, is teaching the children that they are to think of themselves as world citizens. Now, this is interesting because 42.8% of these children come from broken homes. They don't know they can't spell Amsterdam. I mean, maybe they can, but I'm just saying, that's from what we would think about who they are. But he says, you are to be citizens of the world. In his 1942 commencement address, he says, you are to reorganize the world. You must not hate. If other people hate, you must respond with love. Isn't this interesting? Guess who was a student at this school? Martin Luther King. It's about 9th grade at the time that these words are being spoken. The assumption that Martin Luther King learned everything that he learned at Boston University from Gandhi is a little bit problematic. Now, they were familiar with Gandhi, right? Okay. They're familiar with Gandhi, but he didn't first learn it in another place. So let's think about what does it mean to reappropriate curriculum, to lay a foundation in 1919 and just play it out over the years. If you look closely at this rather well-known slide documenting the mass protests that erupted in the 1950s, you will see the curricular ideas taught to 2 generations of black children in segregated schools. Ulysses Bias makes a very important point. I did not realize this as long as he was alive, but now I get it. He used to say, you know, you have to know somebody did something wrong to you. He said, and when you first find out that they did something to you that you didn't know they had done, he said you feel ashamed of yourself. You know, because you think, you mean you did something to me and I didn't know you had done it to me? He said, but after you get through feeling ashamed of yourself, then you say, well, wait just 1 minute. Who did it? And what did they do? That's what's happening in this citizenship curriculum. If I teach you who you are supposed to be in America, and you know how America is violating its own principles, then I just let you see somebody has done something to you. I interviewed Oliver Hill prior to his death. One of the statements that he made was, for me, profound. Oliver Hill, one of the famed NAACP attorneys, said, I went to Howard to overthrow Plessy. Where did he learn that? In Richmond, Virginia, where he's from a black high school. So I think the idea that black educators on a school level could reappropriate language for their own ends, it's a squirrely tactic, if you really think about it. So I'm going to tell my superintendent what I'm doing, and then, as someone said this morning, when I close my door, I'm going to do just what I want to do, okay? And you can't go repeat that I'm teaching explosive pedagogy. All you can ever repeat is, oh yeah, she was teaching us about, democracy. Right? There are a number of other examples of how they reappropriate curriculum that I can't go into tonight, although the industrial education debate changes, the progressive education debate changes, a number of them do. I want to add another one just because that's a small one, just because here again, just speaker prerogative, I just think it's funny. What could be more innocent than a poem? I have some people here from Georgia. Do y'all know the poem? All right. You'll love this example. What could be more innocent than a poem? It's a European, right? It's a European poem. I'm teaching European poems. Except here's the thing. They taught the same poems throughout the South. Particular poems that they pick, and they make little black children memorize them. I see that. They make them memorize them. Now look at the poem. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I think whatever gods may be for my, what? Unconquerable soul. Now the two paragraphs that follow speak of the ways in which chants don't have to diminish you, perhaps as parallel to their ancestors, right, who were captured in slavery, or the menace of the years, as in how they are being treated in segregation. Yet what? Their head is bloody but unbowed. Despite the menace of the years, I'm afraid. I am unafraid. I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul. What is this but a poem that is a lesson in resilience? Okay? No matter what they do to you, you are stronger than that. Now, James Anderson is one of my favorite historians, and I absolutely adore, pretty much as Amy is one of my standard ARA meeting dates, and I usually sit down with James Anderson. You all call him Jim, but when I learned that his people in the South call him James, I decided I'm not saying Jim anymore. And so I love to sit down with James Anderson and just kick ideas around. And we were sitting, I guess we were in Vancouver a couple of years ago, and I was then piloting this idea in my thinking. I said, what do you think about this, blah, blah, blah. And he said, oh yeah, I remember those poems. I said, yeah, most people do. And then he recounted a wonderful story, which I actually called him the other night to ask if I could tell the story. He said, yeah, I was in, and he said, yes. He said, I was in an organization that shall remain unnamed. And in this organization, we were required to learn this particular poem. And so the people stood up and said, you have to know this poem. And he said, as soon as they told us the poem, and these are men, all the men from the South started reciting it. Everyone. There was one guy in there from the North, and he's like, how do all of you know this poem? They were in college. They had not gone to the same high schools. They were in college, but they were Southern. And all the Southern black men knew it. Unfortunately, I'll let you all figure out why, the Northern black college man did not know it. Right, so he's sitting there trying to figure this out. It wasn't just this particular one. There are lots of them. If is another one. If you can keep your head, right? There you go. They all know. They all know these same poems. I even grew up hearing my mother say, it's not raining rain to me, it's raining daffodils. I thought, with every dimple drop I see, wildflowers of the hill. Like, really? Clouds of gray engulf the day and overwhelm the town, but it's not raining rain to me, it's raining roses down. What was she teaching me? Doesn't matter what it looks like outside, because you have the capacity to reinvent it and let it be something different. And so we see this over and over and over. Dr. Du Bois, on one of the Niagara conferences, talks about black children have a right to aspire, to think, to dream. What we see in this utilization of curriculum as a form of resistance, I think, is a way to teach African American children that you are more than just victims. You aren't what the wider world says about who you are. The wider world might say you don't belong, that you can't learn, whatever century it was that they were talking about what the children couldn't do, but that's not actually who you are. Okay. Let's look at a second one. The school is a center of professional practice. Somebody's going to signal me, right? About time? The school is a center of professional practice. You would think, since the educators were not well paid, I mean, after all, in history, that's what we talk about, right? The low salaries. So you would assume that because the educators weren't well paid, that that meant they didn't do anything in the schools. And nothing could be further, actually, from the truth. These educators were not reduced by the fact that they didn't get the money that they should have gotten. Instead, they actually refer to themselves as professionals. They reprove each other as not acting, you're not acting like a professional. Professionals are who they are by their self-definition. It is not until desegregation that they learn that they are not professionals. Because prior to that time, they understood that they were professionals, and they behaved in ways that showed that. There are things that the teachers themselves believe and talk about as professionals. I won't go into that. Much of that is in my earlier work. You know, you can't teach somebody you don't know. You have to want for somebody else's child what you want for your own child. Then you're ready to teach. So kind of these pedagogical values, but a lot of that is in earlier work. I want to talk tonight about the ways in which there was intentionality in their delivery of ideas within their schools. So the first thing about the segregated school is that they describe faculty meetings as opportunities for professional development. So it wasn't just to go and sit and do whatever, but if you're in a faculty meeting, then you're supposed to be having a professional development experience. And they do things to prepare themselves to be able to work together as professionals. And so you'll get things like a faculty survey that a principal gave out. There were 27 questions, but there are things on there like, the faculty should strive to carry out the principal's program, or the faculty meeting belongs to the principal, right? And the teachers would check what they thought and felt about this. What they're trying to do is figure out, what do you think is your responsibility? What do you think is the leader's responsibility? How can we work together from a common framework? And so you see a lot of foundation building activities, at least in this particular school. There are even things like the principal should be a skillful teacher and able to instruct others. I'd love to see how teachers would score that today. The principal and teachers should assume responsibility for student achievement. Things like this that allow people to talk about what it is we're trying to corporately do here. With this kind of professional culture that they create, then they come up with professional practices that will be a part of their school. Now, in this particular slide, I provide one example of a professional practice in this school. If you look at the steps here, and I put them here because I think it's important, again, to see the intentionality. The principal initiates this particular idea. Although the principal didn't have to initiate the idea, what they want to do, by the way, the idea is we want to try a college-type schedule. So we want to have longer classes and meet, so kind of a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday schedule, like we know in colleges. And so they're talking about this. So the principal initiates this idea. The faculty discuss it for several meetings. They seek community input. They get permission from the superintendent to pilot the idea. The idea is piloted, then it's implemented, and then the students actually evaluate it. And in the center, I've got a reprint from the school newspaper. How do you like our new schedule? The results were tabulated from a student body survey of the schedule. And there were questions like, how do you feel about it? Do you think it's helped you or hindered you? And so on and so forth. This is a result, a programmatic result of a professional conversation among educators. But look at the array of other things they do. They say, oh, we should have a democratic study hall. And remember their beliefs about citizenship. We should have a democratic study hall. So in the 1960s, they say, okay, we're going to have a self-policing study hall where students determine when you can go to the bathroom, what you have to do, where they vote the leaders for their particular class, and no teachers involved at all. Okay? And they actually implement this idea. They do a dropout prevention program. They have the kids come early in the morning, feed them breakfast. And one of the most interesting ones, this is the late 60s, so there's a white guy who's now joined their faculty, and he's sitting there drumming a guitar with the students, and they're all talking about kind of how we move forward. And these were the students who were potential dropouts. They decide to play elevator music. Yeah, I know, I felt the same way. He said, the guys looked at me like, elevator music? Yeah, because the principal said, he read that, he read in some fancy publication that hens lay more eggs when they listen to music. And so he said, well, if hens can lay more eggs when they listen to music, then we should have some music, piped through the school for the students. And if a teacher, didn't want it on, she just cut it off. And if you wanted it on, then you could have it on. So they had elevator music. They had a telephone hookup. They found out that the telephone company would come in and work with students who couldn't come to school, and so they created this capacity for the child to call in, which doesn't sound like a big deal to us now, but the white school didn't have it. They didn't even know it was possible, right? But it's something that they did. They create a real business audience for their typing students. They go out into the community and say, hey, you need some letters typed? Oh, okay. How about letting our students type your letters? When we talk about authentic audiences and authentic engagement, that's what's going on. But also, they didn't keep that idea long because the white school heard about it, and then they took it, and then the white school got all the letters. So the point here, then, is that these are professionals who are attempting to solve problems in their own schools. They're not interested in just talking about the problems. They actually want to solve the problems. Is this resistance? I would argue yes. If the mandated curriculum is designed to keep you at the bottom, there's nothing about the practices that they're doing that keep the children at the bottom. What I'm not showing are the ways in which they also attempt to leapfrog, as they call it, the curriculum provided by the state. So if the white schools have this set of curricular expectations, they will actually try to add new courses into the curriculum that are not offered at the area white high school, just so they can say they have this particular class, and they run them. And I'm also not elevating the ways in which they supplement the stated curriculum with black curriculum, stories and history, and just an extraordinary infusion of black history that's interlaced throughout the curriculum. Let's look at a last area. Curriculum, let's figure out how to get around you. School-based activities, let's figure out how to get around you, not let these children be who you want them to be. And the final is the idea of the leader as a trickster or problem solver. The key to the school was the leader, so they said. This leader worked in concert with the teachers, but the leader also had to be visionary in addressing inequalities. Okay, so the leader had to hatch ideas. In this particular case, I'm referring to Dr. Ulysses Bias. They call their game Uncle Tom. Sometimes they call it Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The point is that, to use the West African concept, what you see is not all of who I am. So I'm going to figure out how to give you what you need, but I'm not going to let you reduce what I'm trying to do. It's the trickster figure. Mr. Hunt said, who's one of their generational predecessors, he said, you have to think your way out of problems. He says, we are victims of people who do crooked thinking, he said. And because they think crookedly doesn't mean we should think crookedly. What we should do, he says, the great issues of the world are solved in our minds. So we must figure out how to use our minds to solve the array of difficulties that are coming against us. That's the idea that's going on with the trickster figure. So let's talk about this particular one, Ulysses Bias, who got his master's here at Teachers College. He was funny though, but that's another story. When he went back and tried to implement some of the things, it's funny, but I'll answer that later. Ulysses Bias is in an interesting place because his superintendent is upset with the black community because the black community wants a truancy officer. The truancy officer would not cost very much, but the superintendent doesn't even want to give that. He goes to the school, Professor Bias goes to the school, and he discovers, wow, you all need a whole lot more than a truancy officer in this school. So I've got to figure out how to get what the children need in the school without offending my superintendent because I just got here. So what he does is go to the school and ask if he can conduct a curriculum survey. That sounds very educational, doesn't it? A curriculum survey. Well, the superintendent says, oh, that's a great idea. And the superintendent says, well, what about these parents keep hollering for a truancy officer? What about them? You think you can hold them back? He said, oh, yeah, I think I can hold them back. He'd already talked to him. He said, yeah, I think I can hold them back. He goes to the school, and they begin what becomes a year-long curriculum survey. I put here to the left just a sampling of the kinds of things that they did over the course of this year to find out about the state of the curriculum in a black school. When they finish, he asked the superintendent for money to publish the results in a little blue booklet. And the superintendent said, no, he doesn't have any money to publish the results. And so he goes to his PTA, and he gets money to actually publish the results. Well, he takes them to the superintendent, and the superintendent looks at it. He says, oh, this is terrible. This is terrible. Your children are performing in an awful way. Oh, my, I hope you haven't told anybody. Okay, because this is the late 50s. This is after Brown, right? They're trying to figure out how to keep us in segregated schools. You don't want it to be public what's happening, right? He says, I hope you haven't told anybody how bad this looks. And he says, I just dropped off a copy at the newspaper. Now, Dr. Bias reports that that was actually a lie. He had not dropped off a copy at the newspaper, but as soon as he left the superintendent's office, he did go drop a copy off at the newspaper, and it became front page headlines for 3 consecutive weeks in a weekly paper about just how awful the conditions are at the school. What is the result? He gets new teachers, typewriters, new class. They spend thousands of dollars, right? Because now it's public and they have to fix it, okay? It's the trickster motif. In another place, he is trying to, they've given him a new school, but they won't give him anything to outfit the school. So they want to be able to say publicly, we built the Negro children a new school. But they aren't giving him any money. He said the amount of money they gave him to outfit the school was like $1,200. He said, I had that much furniture in my house. How am I supposed to outfit a whole school with $1,200? And so he says, I decided to ask for nothing. So when I go to the school board and they say, oh, but professor, you're not asking for anything? And he says, well, you know, y'all don't have the money right now. So I figure we just move in the building and keep doing like we've been doing till you find some money. Well, that's a problem. You can't have it in the newspapers that we built the black children a new school and we didn't put anything in it. He says, I reasoned to myself that if they had to start creating priorities for what to fund and what not to fund, they would fund it all, because they would fight among themselves as to what the priorities should be. And that's exactly what happened. It's the trickster motif. We see it over and over in black schools. Here on the right is what they use during integration. What do you think about this integration? The superintendent says, if you're a black principal, you better not say you like it. Okay. What do you think about this integration? He says, well, boss, you know, y'all been handling school matters all this time. I just leave that to y'all. Which is a non-answer. He's actually a part of the hidden agenda that's in the advocacy that's overthrowing it, but the superintendent doesn't know that. When the superintendent says, what about that resolution y'all passed, supporting integration? Well, boss, you know, you're not a member of my organization, so I probably shouldn't discuss with you, you know, what happens in the organizational meetings. See the sleight of hand, the shrewd, I'm telling you, but I'm not fully telling you. You get something similar with Richard Wright of Savannah State, liberal arts trained, amazing man, who when they try to get him to reduce his liberal arts curriculum, just scratches his head. This man goes on to own one of the top black banks in Philadelphia. He just scratches his head and he says, And the white man says, what's wrong with you? He says, well, you know, what's puzzling me is I just can't figure out that white folk in Georgia let a black man in Alabama tell them what to do, referring to Booker T. Washington. The man doesn't know how to answer, and he says, well, you know what, just go ahead on, go on, do the curriculum you've been doing. It's the trickster motif. For a long time, I couldn't figure out how to make sense of this, but now I think I can. They learn these things at their northern institutions. They go back to the South, and they respond to Southern climates. And for the longest, I thought that explained what we see. It wasn't until I was in Ghana this spring, I went to test the theory out with my colleagues there, that I figured out there's also a West African component that explains how they're able to play the tricks. Because one could argue even the appropriation of language is a trick. Right? How are they able to do that? Bias is, in effect, an oral artist. In West African culture, you'll see examples of that where they change words to fit particular situations and circumstances for the benefit of the community. There's a lot I'd love to tell you about that. I won't tonight, but I will say it is a wonderful example that the shores of Africa do not end where the salt water hits that shore. So we've considered then 3 examples of activities within the school in oppressive places, in an oppressive situation. We've looked at the curriculum, we've looked at the school as a center of professional practice, and we've looked at the leader as a problem solver. Embedded through all these ideas is what we call now self-efficacious behavior, a belief that they were actually able to move themselves and their children beyond what anybody expected. And they were very intentional about this. In the 1946 address, at one of those annual meetings that they go to, one of the state meetings, the president says to the teachers, on the shoulders of you people who sit before me now rests much of the hope of our people. You must be ever aware of the great work you're doing. You must also be aware of the tremendous responsibilities placed upon you. Or as Horace Tate would say in the 1960s, we cannot erase the past nor the present inadequacies, but we can and will influence the future by our present dedication to the task at hand. Now, these people we could forget about, except that they took a race from illiteracy to literacy. According to Miyoshi Jurgensen, their work with school dropouts was so substantial that we actually have not been able to change the dropout rate since we fired them at desegregation. They increased college attendance rates in addition to decreasing high school dropout rates. And to my utter amazement, I was at the Carter Center a couple of years ago with one of the scholars from Finland. And he was talking about, why they're so good in education. I had been asked to explain what we might have in Georgia that might help us think about whether we could imitate a Finnish model. To my utter amazement, the best example we have in Georgia of what's happening in Finland is these black educators. I don't know who was more stunned, me looking at him or him looking at me, because who would have ever imagined, okay, the similarity in what's going on. So here we are then. Oppression, resilience. Is this just something we should write into history? So we say, like with the book I love, Exile Within, do we just say, okay, we need to revise our understanding of who these people are in our historical renderings? Or do I dare to say, well, maybe we should think about if there's something from within a school that they could do. Do you think in 2014 we could come up with something within a school that perhaps we could do? Curriculum as resistance? This will be no data. I'm not trying to give any data on this. Just some observations as I close. Curriculum as resistance. When I was teaching high school, they gave me a book to teach my general juniors, and it had a story in there about a big red truck. And I was only 23 years old, but I remember thinking, this is the dumbest story I have ever seen. I'm supposed to teach juniors a story about a big red truck? Really? And I didn't know any of this, but I had sense enough to know that's not how I would engage people who are 17 years old. Okay? In my particular case, I did what I heard one of the teachers say earlier. I just went and did what I needed to do, right, for my own students, and I just did that. But the question of whether or not we are thinking about curriculum in powerful ways, I think is an important question. And whether or not there are ways to look like you're doing what you're not doing is something worth thinking about for the children we're teaching. They would always say, you do what's in the best interest of children. That is the driving force. And so if this curriculum makes no sense, but I can use this curriculum and appropriate the naming to craft something different, I can do that in my classroom when I close the door. What about the school as a center of professional practice? These people had the benefit of being ignored because the superintendent didn't care about them unless there was a problem. And so that certainly created a level of autonomy. But I do wonder whether or not educators work together to redesign the curriculum or whether the work is in isolation today. I think it's worth thinking about. What about problem solving? Being creative. School leaders who are able to trick, if you will, and not afraid to do so. I particularly love the fact that they talk about solving the problems and not just discussing the problems. If I may be personal, some years ago now, please don't try to name the organization or the president. It was not ARA. But a very large national organization asked if I would, they didn't really want me, they wanted somebody else. But the last minute, she couldn't go, so I was, it's a good backup. And they said, and it's the kind of call you get, I think she assumed that I would just say, oh, this is great. So she was like, oh, Vanessa, can you come to Hawaii and talk? I said, well, I actually was just in Hawaii about 6 months ago, and it's a long ways. I said, I didn't realize how far on the other side of California. You have to fly a long ways over there. And so I said, I don't know. I mean, I was actually being really genuine. I said, I don't know. But it's a long ways to Hawaii, and I don't know that Oahu, and I don't know that I feel like going back right now. And I said, and plus, this is my mommy time. This is summer. I'm with my daughter, and I can't leave her. And so she said, well, what about if we fly you and your daughter? okay, well, now you've got my attention. And she said, we'll fly you and your daughter, and we'll put you up on the Waikiki Hilton beachfront. That's what I said. So now I'm listening, right? I'm listening now. So now I said, okay, I hate to, suggest I can't be balked, but apparently I could in that case. And so now I'm listening, and I said, okay, what is it that you want me to talk about? And so she told me. And I said, okay, all right. I think that would be very important. Actually, I would appreciate being able to be a part of a panel like that. I said, how long do I have? And she said, oh, about 10 minutes. I said, 10 minutes? I said, it takes me 10 minutes to say hello. I can't possibly craft that topic in 10 minutes. This is an exact quote. She said, well, these problems are so complex. After all, we can't solve them. Really? You flew me and my daughter to Hawaii. I live in Atlanta. To Hawaii for 3 days. I had a good time. And you never intended to solve the problems. The Black educators actually critique our desegregated spaces. They talk about how when they went to the meetings that everybody talked about the problems, but nobody seemed to be interested in solving the problems. And they said in our meetings, we were trying to figure out how to solve the problems. That was our goal. I think that's an interesting contrast. Well, there's so much more about Black educators that I would love to share. I will tell you that they confound me more and more year by year. I try to make them fit in boxes and paradigms that make sense to me, and inevitably they burst out and go do something that I never expected them to do. I've shared with you tonight just a really tiny part of their work. But I hope if just this little bit can allow even 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people to go back into school settings and begin to think about, is there unharnessed power in my own setting? And where is it? And how can I exploit it without getting fired for the good of my children? Then I think my time at TC would have been well spent. I thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience so late at night.
I just want to thank you for coming. I want to give a couple of thank yous and a brief tribute to Dr. Gordon, follow up on what Amy said. This event was made possible by a number of organizations and entities. I'd like to thank Tom James in the Provost Office. I'd like to thank Ansley Erickson and Callie Waite in the Program for History and Education. I'd like to thank our staff at UME, particularly Veronica Holly, Sandra Overo, and I also like to thank the Center for History and Education for helping us to bring this event together. There are a couple of things that I'd like you to think about from this particular talk, and you can see why we invited Dr. Walker to come, as they relate to the importance of this kind of a space and people who think in this kind of a way. Dr. Gordon started the Institute for Urban and Minority Education in the early 70s, not because nobody was talking about issues in urban education. They just weren't talking about issues related to urban education or multicultural education with any hope or any belief in the populations they were talking about. What he did with the Institute, or what he tried to do, was to think about how do we talk from an asset-based perspective, how do we talk from a solution-based perspective, how do we connect talk to action? I think that's what the legacy is of the institute that he started, the institute that I've tried to uphold and move forward in the lecture series. The first 2 words of the title of your talk say everything: forgotten solutions. One, the importance of looking at a historical perspective and understanding where we've been, but the importance of understanding that we have solved problems greater than the problems that we face today. And if you don't believe that you can solve these problems, the problems can be solved, why put yourself in the presence of children who people love and are believing in you? Whether you're a teacher educator, whether you're a college of education, a superintendent, or a teacher. We all have responsibility to think about solutions because solutions are possible. But it takes hard work. It takes hard work in the classroom. It also takes hard work as scholars to be able to pull out those sorts of stories, to be able to create those sorts of conditions. So the Gordon Lecture will be about solutions. It will be about people who are part of the solution, not just in what they say, but in what they do. Unfortunately, Dr. Gordon could not be here, but his work is part of the solution, in what he does, in the character that he manifests, and the people that he's mentored, and you can see that legacy. There is not a problem in education that we can't solve with the strategies that Dr. Walker brought forth to us. This idea of resistance, this idea of creating strong practice and being the trickster. But there was a point that you made from your earlier work that just kind of slid in, and that is you can't teach people you don't know. And I would add to that, you can't teach people that you don't love. Right? So this knowledge connected with the compassion and the strategies and being uncompromising in your unwavering belief in the brilliance of the people you work with. And that is a forgotten solution from a population of educators that are often under-regarded. And that's something that's so important about Dr. Siddle Walker's work. We will try to walk in those shoes between now and the next Gordon Lecture. As an institute, we will try to walk in those shoes as a college and live up to that tradition. But it's been a special treat to have Dr. Siddle Walker here. It's been a special treat for me to be able to take over the institute that was started with that kind of spirit. But the spirit of everything we believe in was embodied in Dr. Siddle Walker's talks. I'd just like to thank you again for coming, and then thank you all for being here.